All right, so we got another budget quad here from TCMMRC. It's called the TX150, so it's for 3-inch propellers. Talk about the frame here in a second. Electronic-wise, we have an F411 flight controller and 20 amp ESCs. I don't know if this is going to work on more than 4S. They are recommending for this setup here 2 to 4S. But the motors on here are 1507s. I've never heard of this brand before. Hum Quad, 1507, 2400 kV. So at that kV on a 3-inch prop, theoretically you should be able to do 6S, but in the product specs it says that this should be 2 to 4S. So I only flew it on a 4S LiPo. I did not test it on 6S. It did feel a little bit underpowered on 4S, but there's some other issues that we'll talk about here in a second. These are these dowel prop from Foxeer 3-inch propellers, pretty standard. Now this is kind of old school. They went with these sort of clockwise and counterclockwise motors. So they have these silver nuts on this one and then the black nuts on this one. So the nuts thread opposite of each other. So be aware of that. And the props here. So if we oriented the quad like this, like it would be in Betaflight, motor 1 spins clockwise, motor 2 spins counterclockwise like that. The motors themselves are pretty okay, but they have like these copper windings that are kind of very thin, not a lot of power. And then the bearings are smooth on these 3 motors here, but this motor here, it was initially smooth, but now it's a little bit rough. I did crash this a few times, not really hard crashes, but now this motor is a little bit more noisy in terms of the bearings, but for these sort of budget quads, it's not atypical. Now this does come in at a currently, as of the recording of this video, $83.88 plus like about $11 or so shipping. So yeah, it's for a pre-built FPV drone, that's pretty low. I mean, obviously prices vary. You may be watching this in the future, prices might be more, prices might be less, but there was a time when when I originally came out with my first $88 quad video as a 5-inch a while back, that the price went up for a little while, then went back down again. So, it really kind of depends on when you're watching this video. Also, the components tend to sort of change and morph over time, so they may use a different flight controller in the future, switch to maybe from F411 to F405 and back. So yeah, even sometimes they'll specify certain specs on the product page, and then they'll switch it and not switch the listing on or what's actually specified in the product page. So there's all kinds of strange stuff that goes on with TCMMRC. This is typical, but a lot more companies are kind of doing that these days, especially on the ones that are making the lower end equipment. But even like iFlight, for example, they make pretty high end, I would say more pricey equipment. They'll change their specifications from time to time because of part shortages. They can't acquire a certain gyro or a certain MCU, and they'll swap it out for something else and just slightly tweak their sort of PIDs and their product specs and all that kind of stuff. So that happens from time to time, pretty much across the board. The PID tuning here was just like stock Betaflight 431, no tuning whatsoever. The EXCs on here are the 8-bit BB2 EXCs, so you can flash these to BlueJay if you want, but I flew this completely stock out of the box, didn't make any changes, and yeah, so finally, let's just finish off on the specs here before I talk about the flight characteristics. So we have a 400 milliwatt video transmitter, 20x20 here, so these are all 20x20 stacks. As typical for TCMMRC, they did not wire up the smart audio cable, so you would have to solder that on and then solder it to the flight controller on a UART, so that is not set up. They do that pretty much across the board on all other quads. I don't know why that is, but yeah, that is also the case here. So you'll have to take this apart and solder that wire if you want to use smart audio. I just flew it whatever power setting was out of the box. I think it was, on mine, it was defaulted to race band 1, and I'm not sure what the power level was. I think it was maybe like 200 milliwatts. Not 100% sure. I didn't really test that. So it has this little whip antenna here that is kind of flopping down, and I did put a zip tie here to secure it so that it does not kind of go down and then into the props. Is fine here. They, as usual, their S-Bus plug here, there's a little 3-pin plug that runs S-Bus, and so I just pulled that little cable out, and I have this XM Plus receiver that I pulled from my last review of another TCMMRC quad, and I just popped it into this one, although I don't recommend putting the receiver like this. I just kind of stuck it here, and then when I plugged the battery in, it was being held by the battery cables being plugged together, and that was fine, but don't recommend you do it the way I did this, because just put it in here for the review. I just fly it a few times, and I'm going to move it on to the next quad. Probably the next one I'm going to review is the TX220, which is the 5-inch sort of version of this, where basically they're trying to make the low-end quads at around that $83 price point. I believe that 5-inch is also around $83. I'll link that also down in the video description if you want to check it out ahead of time. But yeah, just is like my standard XM Plus receiver wired to that type of plug. I just plug it in there, so I just swap it out, and then I just run my little antennas through under the motor wires like this, and that is totally okay. But if you're buying this and you want to actually secure the receiver correctly, I would recommend putting the receiver probably behind the camera over here, and then you just plug it in right over there, and then run the antennas out the under these motor wires here and in this direction. That should be fine. Now, the biggest problem with this quad is the camera. It's a no-name, CMOS camera. It's has a very narrow field of view lens, and this whole front section here was not. I think it's a design problem. They had some spacers in between the camera side and the side plates, and that's kind of spread it around, and then it was very kind of jiggly and loose, and so when I flew it the first time, I got massive amounts of jello, so it was basically unflyable. And so what I did was I took those little washers out, those little spacers out, and I put some O-rings in instead, some rubber O-rings you can kind of see right there. So that gives it a little bit of sort of cushion, and that allows the camera to be firmly mounted. It doesn't jiggle around in here. However, I'm still getting jello, even though it's very low lighting conditions, and I think it's just because this camera is probably vibrated a lot on that first flight when it was the whole front cage was loose, and maybe the sensor got jiggled off or something. I'm not 100% sure, but the jello is still there. It's not as bad as the initial flight, but yeah, I would recommend, if you get this, the camera would be the first thing I would swap out. It's a 19mm camera. But this frame, I'm not really thrilled about this frame at all. I think this design here with the camera mount is not well thought out. So if you're just like, maybe you just want to get these parts because they're kind of cheap, and moving over to a better frame, that would probably be not a bad idea, actually. And it wouldn't be that hard to move all the stuff over, because it's a pretty standard, typical X-style frame here. And by the way, for those who want to know, it's a 3mm bottom plate, 1.5mm or 2mm top plate, and then they just have these LEDs in the bottom, like so. So I'll just plug this in and just show you what that looks like. It's a bit too bright here, but yeah, it does show up if you're flying at night. But they aren't super bright LEDs. And then those LEDs are driven by this LED board here on the bottom. That's that other 20x20 board. So yeah, you would need some sort of a frame with two 20x20 mounts. And I would again recommend switching the camera out for something better. Honestly, this is a very cheap quad, so this is probably like a $5 camera, maybe even cheaper. And then the good ones like the Run Cams or the ones from like Fox here, they're probably going to run you more like 40-ish, 50-ish, depending upon which model you get. So if you are happen to get this and you want a recommendation on a camera, let me know in the comments below, and I can offer some suggestions. So this is not the stock battery strap. The one that came in here was really thin, and it was a little bit short for this battery, so I put my own battery strap in here. Also, there was no battery pad included, so I have this sort of sticky pad stuff from Flywoo that I got from another quad. I just cut off a little piece and put it there. That offers a little bit of vibration protection for the battery and also prevents it from hitting the screws and also grips it really nice so it doesn't fall out. This is the battery I use. This is a G&B 854S high volt. And here's how much the quad weighs, 263.8. And then with the battery, we're coming in at just a hair over 250. So obviously with just a stock Betaflight tune and no sort of tweaking, it doesn't really fly that great. It does feel a little bit underpowered because of the low kV at 2400 kV. I think this would be better with a different motor. I think the motors on here are the main issue in terms of performance. Maybe it's because of the thin copper wires on the windings. Maybe it's because the kV is too low for this weight. But yeah, I just felt a little underpowered for doing freestyle tricks. But granted, trying to do freestyle tricks on this super narrow field of view camera is going to be pretty tough. If you're getting this as your sort of first quad because you don't want to spend a lot of money, it's going to be okay for just kind of cruising around. But whenever you try and put a lot of throttle in, go to full throttle, it has like this sort of pitching issue. I think that's just a tuning problem. Probably some TPA is going to be needed. It kind of shakes a little bit as well. I'm not a big fan of these particular props either, so a different prop might be better as well. But I think overall it's going to be the frame and the motors, I think, are the biggest downsides of this particular model, and of course the camera. So yeah, I would, if you're just looking to get sort of like these parts and maybe move it to a different frame, that could be fine. If you're just looking for a budget quad, just fly around, cruise it around, that's going to be okay too. But if you're looking for performance at this price point, you're probably going to be disappointed. You should probably spend probably 2 times as much money, maybe a little bit more, 2.5 times, and get something a little bit more appropriate. I'll link some alternatives, more pricey alternatives that are going to perform better down in the video description, along with some links to some previous models that I reviewed. But yeah, this is mainly targeting those that don't have a lot of money, are sticking to their guns, and are not going to spend a lot of money, and just want something to sort of fly around and not necessarily do racing or freestyle. Anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Got any questions, let me know. I'll talk to you guys in the next video.